Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the ZOOM Toolkit. Earlier today, we had a webinar with our aimed at a different target group. So this morning, we discussed the tools that we have developed in the course of the ZOOM Tool project and that are available for developers and knowledge creators. And now in the afternoon session, we're going to be talking about the tools that exist for supporting organizations. So in the ZOOM project, we, in a nutshell, we aimed to create tools and support organizations, businesses and supporting organizations in finding business models and corresponding licensing models that go together. And the focus of this whole exercise was open source technology. So we focused on software, on hardware, and on data to see which business models have corresponding and sustainable licensing strategy over the long run to enable a business to flourish and to actually generate value and, of course, revenue for the company. Because it is very often the case that companies decide to go open source because the founders themselves are open source developers. They've been developing open source their entire life, and they believe that this is part of who they are in a way. So they share the values of open source, and they decide to start a business using open source technologies. But then several years down the line, they realize that they don't actually have a sustainable strategy to help them sustain this business. And for example, we've had cases of software companies complaining that they've been robbed by, for instance, big cloud computing service providers who, as they put it, take our labor for free and they offer it through their platforms as a service to other customers, and they charge money for this. But in a way, the very essence of open source and the definition of open source, stewarded by the Open Source Initiative, allows for this. So there are specific requirements that for a license to qualify as an open source license, it must not contain any field of use or other discriminatory conditions. So that means if you want, for example, to set your license, to set a license condition that a particular application cannot be used in commercial settings or for deployment on cloud computing infrastructure, then whatever license you might have will definitely not be an open source license. So with ZOOM, we wanted to raise awareness about this, first of all, and secondly, create tools to help companies on the one hand and developers, which we discussed in the morning, and supporting organizations, so IP offices, strategists, legal offices, law firms, independent solo lawyers, and so on, advising clients to help their clients and to help their organizations to align their business and licensing strategies when they use open source technologies. So with this in mind, the ZOOM Toolkit was born out of collaborative work in creating the licensing framework, which adopts a methodology called SCP, so Structure, Conduct, and Performance. We study structure of companies taking into consideration factors such as age, experience, business readiness, experience with the emerging, with particular emerging technology, for example, AI. Then studying the conduct of the enterprise in terms of business conduct, so role in an ecosystem, in the ecosystem in which it exists, legal conduct in the sense of how companies manage their intellectual property assets, how do they deal with outbound licensing and inbound licensing, so the software they consume and the software they produce. If we're talking about software, it could also be data or hardware. And then also, of course, the social conduct of the company. So what is the impact of releasing, distributing your products and services under open source licenses, and of course some related ethical considerations. And finally, the performance aspect, where we study the economic sustainability of companies and the legal sustainability and social sustainability, again, everything coming together. So the toolkit, and we will go into a demo session in a few minutes, but just to give you an idea of why it was created the way it was created. So the toolkit is essentially a resource which offers you knowledge, tools, training material, best practices on how to integrate open source technologies into your business, into your products, into your services. So in essence, we created a set of tools distributed in several sections. So you can see here we have open access strategy, open asset strategy, library of cases, training material, and AI as a hybrid asset. So we wanted to provide, first of all, licensing and business tools, so you can, on the one hand, get an understanding of whether your business model is suitable to support open source technologies on one hand, and whether and what the corresponding licensing model should be. So you should always start with the business model, and even as a supporting organization, you should advise your customers, your stakeholders, your clients to always start with properly understanding their business models, their revenue streams, so they can then make an informed decision as to whether open source makes sense for them or not, because not going open source is also a valid answer. We then compiled a library of cases, including business cases, actual real-world company experience with open source software, open hardware, and open data. And this is a very rich and interesting collection of real-world lived experiences of such companies that can, on one hand, inspire you and as a supporting organization and your clients to actually adopt and to perhaps follow some of these models. Of course, some of them are unique. Like, we don't have many Red Hats in the world. Red Hat is just one company, and it was uniquely successful precisely because of the right mix of circumstances, timing, and so on. But that does not mean, of course, that these models cannot be replicated with variations, and they have been indeed. Then training materials, which is essentially a collection of training videos, presentations, slide sets, and then additional resources, reading, and as well as access to some tools. Of course, our collection of training material is not limited to just what we created in the course of Zoom, but rather we take inspiration, and we in fact incorporate many of the readily available resources created by trustworthy and established organizations such as the Free Software Foundation Europe or the Linux Foundation. They have brilliant resources when it comes to advancing and expanding, building further upon the basics that we aim to provide with the training program in the toolkit. And finally, something a bit experimental, I would say, AI as a hybrid asset. What was the point of this? Well, the discussion on open source AI is still ongoing, and there are many nuances to it, and we don't even have the open source initiative is still working on the definition of open source AI. But at the same time, many companies, commercial organizations more generally, have been releasing models, such as, for instance, Meta with their Llama models, because they've been releasing and claiming they're open source, when in fact, if you assess them against the criteria of the open source definition, you would see that they fail many of these criteria. So our idea with this resource was to help you make sense of what's going on in terms of AI as an intellectual asset, because AI is a bit of a unicorn in the sense that it's not just software and it's not just data. Rather, it's a hybrid combination of both software and data. Each of them coming with different usage and access conditions that you must observe. So the idea of this tool, if we call it that way, is to support you in making sense of how you could use AI in your own business and what you need to think about in terms of IP, in terms of contracting, in terms of data usage and access while you are exploring using it and deploying it. So let's get to the tools. Like I said, we have licensing, compliance, and business tools, more generally speaking. So the licensing tools are addressed primarily at companies. You could, for example, as a supporting organization, advise a company to use some of these tools, of course, always with caution and taking into account that none of the advice provided by any such tool is indeed binding legal advice, but still they might help founders and especially underdeveloped or under-resourced companies to make sense of what they have and whether the direction they're taking is the right one or not. So, for example, we'll take a tour through the licensing tools just to give you a taste of what it's all about. Compliance tools, where we have, for instance, tools that will help you manage your code bases, like the Free Software Foundation Europe's reuse tool and its accompanying specification, or other tools, including technical tools, we have collected and summarized in a nice view. A set of materials, including a Docker image, which provides access to additional command line tools that you may wish to incorporate in your daily workflows, and of course also to the companies that you advise or support with your activities. Now, something that is particularly, I think, interesting for supporting organizations would be our guide on establishing a successful open source programs office. So open source programs office are essentially is essentially a service which aims to provide all of these advisory activities and to manage, first of all, community relationships of the companies, because this is a super important part of being part of an open source community, to really manage and curate the relationship that you have with community members. And then also to provide these purely advisory services, like are the licenses that we use compatible with each other? If we use these libraries as input in our own product, can we then release under whatever license we want? If 10 years down the line we decided we want to relicense our code base, can we do this or not? So we take a broad definition of open source program offices. Typically, open source program offices are something that big organizations have the resources and capacity to create. Think IBM, Microsoft, or Google. And indeed, it's expensive to expect starting companies to have, it's actually unrealistic to expect them to have this. But what we suggest with this approach is to set OSPOs as a service. So this can be services established by supporting organizations or by, of course, private entities. So, for example, a business could be organized around the provision of open source program office services. So the idea is to really provide different angles to how to structure such a service, what should be in it, and how to run it continuously so that it's successful. So the different tools are structured per category because, Zoom is about the 3 O's, so open source software, open hardware, and open data, which means that we have slightly different and sometimes very different tools across the different categories. So, for instance, for open source software, you would find a very detailed license decision tree, whereas you won't find as detailed resources for open data or open hardware, because the licensing debate in these fields is much less developed compared to open source software. And let's not forget that the open source definition is essentially based off the idea of open source software, free and open source software. Something particularly useful, as I mentioned, is the business model innovation map for open assets, which again helps you identify a suitable business model, and you could offer this actually as part of your services to your clients, customers, and other stakeholders. And then we have a very, I think, and I hope useful, typified business profiles concerning companies that we identified as, on the one hand, innovative, on the other, relatively realistic, in the sense that there might actually be companies who want to do precisely what we're describing with these typified business profiles. And they outline a typical journey of such a company, the types of questions that they need to ask, and also the risks and opportunities that lie for each of them. So, for instance, we have examples here with startups aiming to enhance sustainable agriculture, or medium-sized companies aiming to become an enabler in an open data ecosystem. So these type of, on the one hand, starting businesses or people and organizations with few resources, and on the other hand, with innovative ideas to a certain degree. Okay, I think there is also the glossary terms, which is mostly useful to individual developers and knowledge generators, not so much to you as a supporting as a representatives of supporting organizations, but still they might come in handy. We also have a frequently asked questions section, which focuses really on practical questions such as, for example, how can I generate revenue using open hardware? And we try to provide answers that guide you in the right direction, and so as for you to make an informed decision. The library of cases, I mentioned, this can be particularly useful for supporting organizations because you can direct your customers or clients to the right profile of a company that already exists and is more or less doing something that, for instance, your client or customer wants to do. So they can read, check, compare, and explore further. And why not even talk to some of them, because many of these companies are actually not large organizations by any means, which means that they might find useful exchanging best practice with them, especially given the fact that practically all of them subscribe to the ethos of open source in one way or another. And then the training modules, like I said, that you will find two categories of free sources in this section. So one is the basic courses, for example, a basic introduction into open source licensing, what it is, how it works, or, for example, the technological aspects of open source development, or how people should be managing open source projects on GitHub, for example, stuff like that. And then you have the more advanced modules, such as again, technological aspects, or more detailed discussions of licensing and business questions, including how to actually go about consulting and strategically supporting companies that want to engage more thoroughly with open source. And finally, this tool that I mentioned about AI. So let's go into and take a look actually at the real toolkit. I have it here open for you. So if we go to the main web page of the Zoom website, you will find in the upper right corner the button to ZOOOM Toolkit. And if you click on it, it's going to take you straight to the ZOOOM Toolkit. So you have two options from here. You could either click Get Started, and it will take you immediately to the tools, or you could choose one of these categories. For instance, if you are here just for the training material, you could just click on Training Material, and it will take you straight to this section. So we provide two gateway entry points, sort of, to the toolkit. Let's go with the Get Started. As you can see, it takes you straight to the different tools that we have. So, for instance, if we take licensing to, let's imagine you have a customer who doesn't really know, is not sure what license they should or could choose for their product or service. You could, for instance, go to the Zoom licensing decision tree, and then if we click here, you could then follow the procedure. So let's give it a try with an example. The first question in our license selection decision tree is whether you want to restrict the use of the software, because this is really the primary difference between proprietary and open source licensed software, if we're talking about software, because there are not any open source license you have as a minimum guarantee the full freedoms to run, study, modify, and share modifications of the software. If you want to restrict any of these, or if you want to introduce, as it is mentioned here, for example, non-commercial uses, or limiting the use in cloud services, then you would clearly, your product would clearly not be a good match for an open source license. So if we say, yes, I want to restrict the use of the software, you would get your answer straight. Open source is not an option for you. Now, of course, you could argue that this is overly simplified, and you might have some assets that might make sense to be licensed under open source license, and others that won't. And this is discussed in other documents that you can find in the outcomes section on our Zoom website. But the idea really is here to simplify the journey as much as possible, so that it's useful after all to the person using it. So now let's answer with yes, with no, I don't want to restrict the use of software, which will take us to the second question. For example, do you seek maximum adoption? Let's say we want to make sure that everybody can do whatever they wish with our product, so long, with our piece of software, so long as they comply with the conditions of the license, of course. So if we say yes to this question, then the third question would be, Would you like to get attribution when people use your software? Yes, of course, because if you don't care about attribution, for example, you could also dedicate your software to the public domain. But let's say, yes, I would like to get attribution. And then the fourth question is whether we would like to grant express patent licenses, for example. That would depend, of course, on the profile of the company, whether they have a rich portfolio of patents or not. So let's assume, for the sake of simplicity, that we don't want to grant express patent licenses. And then we have a fifth question, whether we would like our license to be compatible with GPL v2. There may be many reasons for such a requirement, and given our time constraints today, we will not discuss them, but they're discussed at length in the supporting documents that you will find on our website. So let's say that yes, we would like our license to be compatible with the GPL v2, and then we get our recommendation. You could go with either MIT or the BSD license. So really, the idea is to make this as simple as possible for organizations. So now, because we only have 6 minutes left, I would suggest that we also explore the open source program office tool, where you get essentially a description. This is a service matrix, as we call it. So for a technology transfer office, open source program office supporting an academic researcher. So you can see here the different aspects that you need to consider and what capabilities are necessary or activities that need to be taken into account. You could have this either as downloaded as a PDF. And here we have an example of how the metrics can be applied to the customer journey of a researcher. There you go. So this is something obviously for you to explore, but the idea of setting up an OSPO is really to support these kinds of customer journeys. And we focus on researchers and companies starting companies because they're usually the most under-resourced. When it comes to that, we have also got something called service portfolio analysis. So this is the list of services that typically an open source program office offers, and they're clustered here in 5 different categories. So organizations can use this template to identify currently offered services, because not all of the services will be new, of course, and then services that might have to be introduced over time, and think about them and consider what would make sense and what wouldn't. So an open source program office has a relatively flexible structure. There are some minimum activities that you need to be doing to qualify as an open source program office, obviously. But other than that, and since we suggest a model that is based on as a service as opposed to rigid structure within an organization, you could be quite flexible with it. So we assume and we know that it's going to be the case. At the very beginning, there will only be a limited number of services available at the level of organizations. And you could use actually this FigJam template as a collaboration tool, for example, to organize a workshop and decide on what other services might make sense to you. So you can see here, for example, from an IP management perspective, you would need to help your customers define a legal IP strategy, deal with due diligence for open source, especially as they undergo investment rounds, metrics and reporting, and also governance of the open source program office itself. Then also there are advisory services regarding technology, such as the compilation of bill of materials or community management, as you can see here, software disclosure procedures, or mapping of relevant projects that might be of interest. Same goes for cybersecurity, environment, and also, of course, awareness raising activities and training activities, which fall in this broader category of human resources. And then for hardware and data, we have some specific aspects, such as, for example, some manufacturing services, so linking companies with manufacturing facilities where they can actually produce and implement in atoms, so to say, not just in bits, their product. And the same for open data, so services related to data management training, publishing, or data quality assurance, which is something, again, that companies, especially providers of high-risk AI systems, are now obliged under the AI Act to ensure that their data that they use, they have, first of all, a reasonable data management program, and that they apply high standards of data quality. So these sorts of services might and should play an important role in any open source program office. So an open source program office is really not just about compliance. It is not just about software either. It's the way we design it here, the way we suggest it should be implemented is much broader. And of course, this would require analysis of resources, how it could be maintained over time, sustainability strategy, and also whether the office should be a centralized entity within for example, a supporting organization, or whether it could be configured, so to speak, on demand. So, for example, you know that for this particular company, you need a resource, a particular expert, and then you might have a pool of experts to pick from and configure a team, an OSPO team on demand to meet the needs of your client or customer. So this is, of course, all subject to adjustments, but the general idea is this. And since we're out of time, I suggest that you take a look at our ZOOOM Toolkit online. Please provide feedback, because as you can read in our notice here, this is still being in pre-release. We are still updating many of the tools. In fact, we aim to release all of the tools in the ZOOOM Toolkit under, it's already released actually, under Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. They will be uploaded to a public repository online. And during our final conference on the 27th of September in Brussels, we're going to launch the ZOOM community, part of which in the program document, we foresee that these certain activities regarding the future development and maintenance of these toolkit, and of course adapting it to the different needs of different stakeholders, including supporting organizations, but also developers and more generally knowledge creators. So thank you very much. Take a look at the toolkit and send us your feedback.